This is Dr. Bev Knox with my psychology tutorials. Learn psychology while you sleep. Please subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications to receive new psychology tutorial information. You may also share recordings from this channel. We're in Module 1, going over contemporary psychology. How has our understanding of biology and experience, culture and gender, and human flourishing shaped contemporary psychology? The young science of psychology developed from the established fields of philosophy and biology. Wundt was both a philosopher and a psychologist. James was an American philosopher. Freud was an Austrian physician. Pavlov, who pioneered the study of learning, was a Russian physicist. Piaget, the last century's most influential observer of children, was a Swiss biologist. These folks definitely studied the mind, but also illustrate psychology's origin in many disciplines and from many countries. Like these pioneers, today psychologists are citizens of many lands. We are talking about in China, for example, the first university psychology department began in 1978. By 2008, there were nearly 200. Moreover, thanks to international publications, joint meetings, and the internet, collaboration and communication now cross borders. Psychology is growing and it's globalizing. The story of psychology, the subject of my tutorials here, continue to develop in many places, at many levels, with many ranges from the study of nerve cell activity to the study of international conflicts. Let's talk about the evolutionary psychology and behavior genetics. Are our human traits present at birth, or do they develop through experience? This has been psychology's biggest and most persistent issue. But the debate over the nature-nurture issue is ancient. Can you believe that? The debate, one of psychology's biggest debate, is about the nature versus nurture controversy. It's ancient. It's not anything modern. The Greek philosopher Plato assumed that we inherit character and intelligence and that certain ideas were inborn. So if something was inborn, it's the nature perspective. Aristotle countered that. There is nothing in the mind that does not first come in form of external world through the senses. That is definitely the nurture perspective. So again, the whole nature-nurture controversy started way, way, way long ago. It's nothing modern. In the 1600s, European philosophers rekindled the debate. John Locke argued that the mind is a blank slate on which experience writes. So whenever you hear someone say, the mind is a blank slate, it means they were not born with innate abilities. It means they hold the nurture perspective. Environmental influences, made us who we are today. Okay? So again, John Locke argued that the mind is a blank slate on which experience writes. René Descartes disagreed, believing that some ideas are innate. And again, we know what innate means, right? Born with the ability to, from within. So that is the nature perspective. Whenever you hear the word innate, nature perspective. Descartes gained support from a curious natural of 2 centuries later, of course, because in 1831, an indifferent student, but a collector of beetles. Yes, I said a collector of beetles and shells, set sail on a historic round the world journey. The 22-year-old voyager, none other than Charles Darwin, pondered the incredible species variation he encountered, including tortoises on one island that differed from those on nearby islands. Darwin's 1859 On the Origin of Species, that's his book entitled On the Origin of Species, explained this diversity by proposing the evolutionary process of natural selection. From among chance variations, nature selects traits that best enable an organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. Darwin's principle of natural selection, what philosopher Daniel Dennett in 1996 has called the single best idea anyone has ever had. It is still with us 150 years later as biology's organizing principles. Evolution also has become an important principle for the 21st century. This should surely have pleased Darwin, who believed his theory explained not only animal structures, such as the polar bear's white coat, but also animal behaviors, such as the emotional expressions associated with human lust and rage. The nature-nurture issue recurs throughout this text, and of course all the psychological tutorials I will be going over, we will always be referring back to the nature-nurture issue. It's a very controversial issue. And, we ask, for example, how are we humans alike because of our common biology and evolutionary history? How are we alike and how do we differ? That's the focus of evolutionary psychology, of course. And how are we diverse because of our difference in genes and environments? What's the focus of behavior genetics? Are gender differences biologically predisposed or socially constructed? Is children's grammar mostly innate or formed by experience? How are intelligence and personality differences influenced by hereditary and by environment? These are all questions that we're asking as psychologists. Are sexual behaviors more pushed by inner biology or pulled by external incentives? Should we treat psychological disorders, such as depression, for example, as disorders of the brain, disorders of thought, or both? Such debates continue. Yet, over and over again, we will see that the contemporary science of nature-nurture tension dissolves. Nurture works on what nature endows. Our species is biologically endowed with an enormous capacity to learn and adapt. Moreover, every psychological event, which is every thought and every emotion, is simultaneously a biological event. Thus, depression can be both a brain disorder and a thought disorder. Interesting stuff. A nature-made nature-nurture experiment. Let's talk about that. Because identical twins have the same genes, they are ideal participants in studies designed to shed light on hereditary and environmental influences on intelligence, personality, and other traits. Studies of identical and fraternal twins provide a rich array of findings described in other modules, of course, which we will be going over. It underscores the importance of both nature and nurture. And on most of my exams, when we talk about the nature nurture perspective, you've got to be able to define and explain what nature is and what nurture is. And you also have to know about epigenetics, because that is known as the new science, which I will cover later on in another module. Okay, so again, I'm a little break in here. You have to know what the whole nature nurture controversy is in psychology. You have to be able to define what nature is and what nurture is. Give me an example, one example, giving me the perspective of nature and the perspective of nurture, also being able to define what is epigenetics. Let's move on to cross-culture and gender psychology. What can we learn about people in general form psychological studies done in one time and place, often with people from what Joseph Henrich, Stephen Henney, and others call the weird cultures? As we will see time and time again, culture shared, which of course is shared ideas and behaviors that one generation passes on to the next, matters. So let me say this again. Culture matters. And what is culture? The enduring behavior, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to another. Our culture shapes our behavior. Our culture shapes our behaviors. It influences our standard of promptness and frankness, our attitude towards premarital sex and varying body shapes, our tendency to be casual or formal, our willingness to make eye contact, our controversial distance, and much, much more. Being aware of such differences, we can restrain our assumptions, and others will think and act as we do. It is also true, however, that our shared biological heritage unites us as a universal human family. The same underlying process guides people everywhere. People diagnosed with special learning disorder, formerly called dyslexia, exhibit the same brain malfunction whether they are Italian, French, or British. Variation in languages may impede communication across cultures, yet all languages share deep principles of grammar, and people from opposite hemispheres can communicate with a smile or a frown. People in different cultures vary in feelings of loneliness, but across culture, loneliness is magnified by shyness, low self-esteem, and being unmarried. We are each in certain respects like all others, like some others, and like no other. Studying people of all races and cultures helps us discern our similarities and our differences of human kinship and our diversity. For example, culture and kissing. Let's talk about that. Kissing crosses all cultures. Yet how do it vary? Imagine yourself kissing someone on the lips. Do you wilt or tilt your head right or left? In Western cultures, in which people read from left to right, about 2/3 of couples kiss right, as in William and Kate's famous kiss, of course, and in other structured, sculptured kisses. Right to left or left to right kissing depends on the culture you're from. Okay, let's talk about gender. You will see throughout these psychology tutorials, modules, that gender matters. Researchers support gender differences in what we dream, in how we express and detect emotions, and in our risk for alcohol use disorder, depression, and eating disorders. Gender differentiates, of course, and but also fascinates us, and studying them as potential benefits. For example, many researchers have observed that women carry on conversations more readily to build relationships, while men talk more to give information and advice. Knowing this difference can help us prevent conflicts and misunderstandings in everyday relationships. But again, psychologically, as well as biologically, women and men are overwhelmingly similar. So even though there are differences, okay, even though there are gender differences, there are overwhelmingly amounts of similarity between men and women. Whether male or female, we learn to walk about the same age. We experience the same sensations of light and sound. We feel the same pangs of hunger, desire, and fear. We exhibit similar overall intelligence and well being. The point to remember: even when specific attitudes and behaviors vary by gender or cross cultural activities, as they often do, the underlying causes are pretty much the same. Are pretty much the same. Let's talk about positive psychology, which happens to be one of my favorite perspectives in psychology, by the way. Positive psychology. And there's always a short essay in my in my classes on positive psychology. Psychology's first 100 years focus on understanding and treating troubles such as abuse and anxiety, depression and disease, prejudice and poverty. Much of today's psychology continues to explain such challenges without citing the need to repair damage and cure disease. So, whereas most of the other perspectives of psychology focuses on the dysfunction itself, positive psychology doesn't. Martin Seligman and others have called for more research on human flourishing. These psychologists call their approach positive psychology. They believe that happiness is a byproduct of a pleasant, engaged, and meaningful life. Thus, positive psychology uses scientific methods to explore the building of a good life and engages our skills and a meaningful life that points beyond ourselves. In future modules, we will be going over positive psychology more in detail. But just remember this: positive psychology is the scientific study of human functioning with the goals of discovering and promoting strengths and virtues that help individuals and communities to thrive. It is known as the study of human prospering or happiness. Psychology's three main levels of analysis. What are psychology's levels of analysis and related perspectives? Each of us is a complex system that in part is of a larger social system. But each of us is also composed of smaller systems, such as our nervous system and body organs, which are composed of still smaller systems like cells, molecules, and atoms. This tiered system suggests different levels of analysis, which offer complementary outlooks. It's like explaining horrific school shootings, for example. Is it because the shooters have brain disorders or genetic tendencies that cause them to be violent? Because they have been rewarded for violent behavior? Because we live in a gun promoting society that accepts violence? Such perspectives are complementary because everything is related to everything else. Today, together, different levels of analysis from inherited biopsychology approach, which considers the influences of biology, psychological, and social cultural factors. So you could have a perspective, one perspective answering, this whole issue of school shootings. So, you could take the approach of the, cognitive psychology, biology or neurosciences, the humanistic, what have you. But again, we choose, according to research, of course, different levels of analysis from an integrated approach. And we're talking about the influences from the biological viewpoint, psychological viewpoint, and social cultural factors. Each level provides a valuable playing card in psychology's explanatory deck. It's a vantage point for looking at a behavior of mental process. Yet each by itself is incomplete, and that is something we have to understand. Each by itself is incomplete. Like different academic disciplines, psychology varied perspective ask different questions and have their own limitations. One perspective may stress the biological, component, another the cross-cultural, the other the psychological. But the different perspective described complement one another. Consider, for example, how they shed light on anger. Okay, so let's talk about that. Someone working from a neuroscience perspective might study brain circuits that cause us to be what? Red-faced or hot under the collar. Someone working from the evolutionary perspective might analyze how anger facilitated the survival of our ancestors' genes. Someone working from the behavior genetics perspective might study how hereditary and experience influence our individual differences in temperament. And the list goes on and on and on. And I try to stress this in all my classes. We are never to look at any subject matter, one with rose-colored glasses, but with a narrow, one-dimensional perspective. We are never to do that. We are to consider whatever it is we're talking about, and it could be a mental disorder or a social factor, or whether it's depression or whether it's racism or sexism or any of that. We are to look at it using various perspectives, not just one. Again, levels of analysis, the differentiating complementary views from biological to psychological to cross-cultural for analyzing any given phenomenon. Psychology's current perspectives, and that's something I believe all students, especially psych students, need to understand, that there are major models in psychology. We have to know them. We have to know what their focus is. And we also have to know, be able to give examples of these subfields using the perspective. So I'm going to go over some of psychology's current perspectives, again. Neuroscience. Neuroscience focuses on how the body and brain enable emotions, memory, and sensory experiences. Neuroscience. Evolutionary. Evolutionary focuses on how the natural selection of traits was promoted the survival of genes. Evolutionary. Behavior genetics focuses on how our genes and our environment influence our individual differences. Psychodynamic perspective focuses on how behavior springs from unconscious drives and conflicts. That's the psychodynamic perspective. Behavioral perspective focuses on how we learn observable responses. The cognitive perspective focuses on how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. And the social cultural perspective, how behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. I believe this is so important in understanding psychology that I'm going to go over it again and pause a little bit to assist you in thinking about the definition as I explain. What is neuroscience? Neuroscience focuses on how the body and brain enable emotions, memories, and sensory experiences. Some sample questions could be, how do pain messages travel from the hand to the brain? How is blood chemistry linked with moods and motives? Examples of subfields using this perspective of neuroscience are biological, cognitive, and clinical. Evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary perspective focuses on how the natural selection of traits has promoted the survival of genes. Some sample questions would be, how does evolution influence behavior tendencies? Examples of subfields used in this perspective can be biological, development, and social. Behavior genetics. Behavior genetics focus on how our genes and our environment influence our individual differences. Some sample questions can be, to what extent are psychological traits such as intelligence, personality, sexual orientation, and vulnerability to depression products of our genes or our environment? Examples of subfields used in this perspective: personality, developmental, legal, and forensics. That was behavior genetics. Another perspective, psychodynamic, focus on how behavior springs from unconscious drives and conflicts. Some sample questions can be, how can someone's personality traits and disorders be explained by unfulfilled wishes and childhood traumas? Examples of subfields used in this perspective: clinical, counseling, and personality. Behavioral perspective focus on how we learn observable responses. Some sample questions can be, how do we learn to fear particular objects or situations? What is the most effective way to alter our behavior, say to lose weight or stop smoking? Some examples of subfields used in this perspective: clinical, counseling, or industrial organizational. Now let's talk about the cognitive perspective. The cognitive perspective focuses on how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. Some sample questions would be: how do we use information in remembering, reasoning, and problem solving? Some examples of subfields used in this perspective would be cognitive neuroscience, clinical, counseling, and industrial organization. And the social cultural perspective focuses on how behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. Some sample questions would be: how are we alike as members of one human family? How do we differ as products of our environment? Some examples of subfields used in this perspective are developmental, social, clinical, and counseling. Again, this is Dr. Bev Knox, and these are my psychology tutorials. Learn psychology as you sleep. You can follow along with me or just listen at night as you fall asleep. I will be talking very, very slow in order to benefit you, the listener, you, the learner. Subscribe to my channel, Dr. Bev Knox. Turn on notifications to receive new psychology tutorial information. You may also share recordings from this channel. Psychology tutorials, learn psychology while you sleep.